Okay, good evening, dear friends. I'm very glad to see you again here, and I welcome you to the 6th lecture of this year open lecture series organized by Faculty of Architecture of the Estonian Academy of Arts, and the lecture series is supported by Cultural Endowment of Estonia. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sir Peter Cook. Before I start, I would just like to talk a small personal thing. When I was a student, then I bought my first book about architecture. I was in the 3rd year, I guess, and it was about Archigram. I didn't know about that then, but it was a bloody interesting book, I have to say. And thank you, Peter, I got now the signature in my book. Peter Cook is the founder of Archigram, a former director at the Institute for Contemporary Art, London, and Bartlett School of Architecture at University College, London. His ongoing contribution to architectural innovation was recognized via the conferral of a honorary doctorate in April 2010 by the Lund University. His achievements with radical experimentalist group Archigram have been the subject of numerous publications and public exhibitions, and were recognized by the Royal Institute of British Architects in 2002. When members of the group were awarded the RIBA's highest award, the Royal Gold Medal. In 2007, Peter was knighted by Queen for his services to architecture. Peter is currently a senior fellow of Royal College of Art in London. His professorships include those of the Royal Academy University College London and Hochschule für Bildende Künste in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. He's a partner in CRAB, the Cook Robertham Architectural Bureau, which was formed in 2006 after Sir Peter Cook and Kevin Robertham curated the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Peter has from the very beginning made waves in architectural circles. I would like to mention his work like Art Museum in Graz in Austria, Vienna Business and Economics University's Departments of Law and Central Administration Buildings, which got a RIBA European Award 2014, and Bond University in Australia's Aberdeen School of Architecture, and Drawing Studio Arts University in Bournemouth, which got the RIBA National Award in 2016. Peter has also built in Osaka, Nagoya, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Madrid. It's my pleasure. So please join me welcoming Professor Sir Peter Cook.
Well, I got a lot of pictures to show you, and a fair amount to say, I guess. The title is really apropos a whole series of conversations that go back to a time when it was presumed that people who did drawings, and there was a particular sort of pair of almost 2 generations of people who were students or teachers both at the AA in London, and we all did drawings, and we were all really dismissed by architects around town by being kind of artists, dreamers, wankers, basically. And then one come to realize in a series of observations 10, 20 years later, we all had built. We all actually did build. Nearly all the people who did the drawings had built, and the buildings amongst us all. And this covers a range of people from Ron Heron, Rem Koolhaas, Nigel Coates, Peter Wilson, Zaha, obviously, and so on. All of us had built, some more than others, of course. And so what did those people say then? And my interest then is to try and trace in my own terms, in my own set of observations, the link, if there is a link, a sort of cyclical link, really, between the things you dream of and the things that you might do, and to suggest that some of those dreams were not actually unbuildable. And I think the core point around which I can make that prognosis is that actually the Kunsthaus in Graz, where Colin and I were very lucky, I think, in having a highly sympathetic jury, also lucky in pulling the building off within 2 months of its deadline and within 2% of its budget, which for an arts building, the best of times, is almost coming in on the button. If you could build Graz, which is not high-tech, it's crap-tech, but nonetheless, if you can build Graz, you could have probably built 60, 80% of some of the other stuff. Anyhow, the trigger presumably is this one, and, yeah, you didn't tell me. Forward is, well, can you just tell me which is forward on this thing? Or shall I'll use a computer, okay. But I would like to say I'm pleased to be back here in Tallinn. This is my third visit, only my second in giving a lecture. And years and years and years ago, if I go back into the time when your country was locked off from Western Europe, the rest of Western Europe, or the rest of Europe, for reasons you know better than I do, that one nonetheless was getting strange, mysterious messages coming through, more or less via Helsinki, about some people called Leonard Lapin and Vilen Konepu. I still remember those names, and I don't know whether either of them are sitting in the audience. It would be wonderful if they were. Hi, which one are you? Right. Good. We heard about you guys, we heard about you via Helsinki and via odd things, that competitions you were winning, and then, of course, the link with the paper architects of Moscow and so on. And from that time on, one kept the odd nostril going. Sort of, it's kind of weird in Estonia, and it's kind of talented, and they're kind of, and even the stuff I just saw in the women's exhibition yesterday is a lot of funny, quirky stuff. And the word quirky, you should learn, because if you didn't already know it, because I think it summarizes the edges of the mainstream situation. Now, whether my work is quirky, I leave others to decide. That's not really the point of this lecture. The point is really the connection. But I just wanted to say to you, I'm not just coming here, oh, what is it today? It's Tallinn. What is it tomorrow? It's, wherever. No, I want to connect with this place, which is why I put the question mark at the bottom. So in the next few days, both on the juries tomorrow and perhaps over the weekend, I want to get to reinforce my nostril to see whether there really is some interesting, quirky stuff going on in Estonia, or whether that was a certain moment in time. We shall see. So I have divided this whole chat into lots of sections. The first section is called Dreams of the City. The city, it's curious, because the city, I think, is a very emotive word. It's a word that we can apply even to places that are really quite small. It's a notion of this coagulation, this coming together of disparate individuals and perhaps disparate architectures. That could be discussed, of course. Many, many years ago, I made this project called Plug-in City. In fact, the earlier drawings, which I'm not, I think, showing you today, but the earlier drawings came before I was teaching, and this drawing came after 1 year of teaching. I have to explain that I never had the privilege of anonymity with any students, because just before I was hired by the A to teach, after 2 years of being a critic, the Plug-in City had been published, not obscurely, but in the best-selling weekend newspaper. 2 million people saw that funny scheme. And these students, I recall, faced me on the first day. I was introduced as the assistant to the diploma year master, the 5th year master. But the normal assistant to the diploma master is a sort of humble creature who sort of walks behind the professor and doesn't... No, I had not that anonymity. I was this shitface who'd done this project. And they said, God, do we have, what happens? In fact, of course, I had to be the real assistant. And then my boss had a nervous breakdown. I was effectively running the 5th year at the AA with several people older than me, many people my age, and it was baptism by fire. I became a kind of amateur psychologist, I think, in the process of really hand-holding. It wasn't just a question of telling them where to put the staircase. It was a question of picking them up off the floor. It was a very competitive place. So that drawing was the first drawing done after a year of not doing any drawings. And probably that year of having to pit my wits through other people's psychology was very useful, because I think it's infinitely more loaded and sophisticated than the earlier versions of Plug-in City, but one would need a longer lecture, even longer lecture to explain it. And it led through other territories. The notion of the city as being to do with communication, I think, was something that was taught during my period as a student. If you look at the histories of British projects of the 50s, 60s, 70s, you will find a great emphasis placed upon communication systems, not necessarily by using electric cars, as was this diagram, but communication in general, pathways, connectors, flash gaps, linkages, bridges. It's always in our psychology. And I would even posit the notion that the English attitude towards movement is almost rather like the English attitude towards narrative, which is that it inevitably involves sidetracking. If you read an English novel, it will tend not to necessarily have heroes and villains, not necessarily just the main path of the narrative leading to a conclusion, but all sorts of asides and little things. And so I find wandering around the path that goes around the edges of your old town wall, the fact that it deviates, sometimes it's close to the wall, sometimes close to the tram, but it doesn't necessarily lead you directly from A to B, extremely, extremely pleasant coming from the English perspective, but I digress. The city then remained as a thing that you could love and you could hate, and you could dissect it. You could fragment the city into almost an encampment of a village that might come together for a moment and contain a variety of elements from the highly technical to the rather ordinary. A city could be put in the form of like a traveling circus. You could bring some of the essences, some of the intensity of the city to a small village for a moment, for a week. And the idea was that this apparatus would pack up and trundle on in a series of trucks. And surprisingly, I even later applied it to the town that I had done my first and lived as a teenager in, which is Bournemouth, which is a seaside town. This, incidentally, is something that always amuses me about this drawing, which is it's an absolutely crappy drawing. It's one of the worst, technically worst drawings I've ever done. But it is much coveted by collections. It's in the Frac collection in France, and they circulate it endlessly. For some reason, people think this is an important drawing, but it points to the fact that an important drawing is not necessarily a good drawing. It's one which somehow captures the notion, which is intriguing. It's an absolutely terrible drawing if you look at it. And in examining the city, there have been various situations I found myself. For example, when I was spending a lot of time in Frankfurt, 5 days every 2 weeks for several years, I became interested in the absurdity that Frankfurt has another town called Offenbach, which sits alongside it. And it's really weird. Even now, and I've been back recently, the atmosphere of Offenbach vis-a-vis Frankfurt is almost like a 25-year gap. You go into Offenbach, it's like going back in time. It's a funny, creepy, suppliant little city. And the two sit alongside each other. And I said, hey, you know, Frankfurt's weird. Why doesn't it make a proper city between the two? And so Real City was my project to link Frankfurt and Offenbach with this avenue, rather sort of 19th century bourgeois idea, except that it put the backyard industries right into the avenue. And the idea was that you'd build a series of hulks, which you see in the right-hand side, and you would then inhabit those hulks gradually with matter, whatever people wanted to come along, whatever architecture, some of it temporary, some of it not, some of it wild, some of it ordinary. You would inhabit those hulks. Fast forward to very much more recently, this is only like a year ago, when we've been doing some studies to support a new town which is coming up in Western Australia called Yanchep, where one was doing a series of studies about the park, the open space, the lung, and bringing the lung into the city and how you might do this. Largely, in fact, by infesting the whole system with vegetation, not just in special places like botanical gardens, which the Australians love, but infesting every street and maybe even every rooftop. Whether they'll actually do it like that, we don't know. And then there have been sort of almost flick of the wrist projects. This is something that had no program. I just started somewhere in the middle of the drawing and kept drawing it till I got bored with it, till there wasn't any more paper left, actually. And it's a sort of speculation about, again, the vegetated city. And I think there is already ones beginning to suggest that there's a loop between a project like this, which nobody is going to come along with this particular configuration of islands, which I've invented, nor are they going to ask somebody like me to infest the whole configuration with a city. But one just draws. It's a sort of scribble, really. It's a kind of overdone scribble, where one says, well, let's see what happens if you draw, this happens, and that happens, and this. And then that goes somehow in your back pocket. You sort of save it in your back pocket. And at some point, you bring stuff out of the back pocket and apply it to something which perhaps has a more straightforward brief. So one has these dreams. There is the dream of the three-dimensional city, which I've been fascinated with as an idea for a very long time. Of course, you can go to somewhere like Hong Kong, where the three-dimensional city is sitting, I would say, in your face, over your face. And my favorite part of Hong Kong, you see the beginning of it on the right, is this condition on Hong Kong Island in the central, where you can go up a series of escalators, up and up and up the hill. I think there are 12 or more. And the landing of each escalator is a striation of the city as it moves up the hill. So you move up the escalator and hit another configuration. It's a slightly similar situation in Haifa, where there's a sort of diagonal underground railway that links 4 of these striations. The notion that you climb over the ground in a three-dimensional city fascinates me, and one has applied that also to various competition projects. Most of the competition projects have failed to win, and the odd buildings are the product that I have, are the product when you do win. And this one is still one of my favorites. It was for Taipei. It was a music center, where a very long, thin strip, where one examined the notion of both dancing over the ground and also making the constituent buildings metamorphose in type. So on the left-hand side at the bottom, you will see rather rectilinear buildings, almost de Stil in mannerism, which are very highly colored. And as you move to the western side, you find the buildings gradually melt and become freeform, but the color decreases. So there are two things happening. The straight buildings are bright, and the, what shall I call them, freeform buildings are monochrome. Meanwhile, the path system and the stream link the whole thing together. Other ideas have occurred. This was a master plan which did at one point look like happening till they kicked the mayor out, in a town called Pinto near Madrid, where one was almost taking that rather romantic view of the small town, admittedly a small town which is 20 minutes on the train to the center of Madrid. What happens at this small town probably is that anybody who's sort of still got some vitality gets on the train, goes into the center of Madrid, and crawls back home at about 4 a.m, slightly pissed. But one still has that view that the little community, the little town, and we were planning to double the size of the little town, should have its own center, should have its own atmosphere, should recreate some of the aspects of living in a community. The boardwalk would have people, playing out the role of the flaneur, guys sitting next to the kiosks, having a cigarette, maybe flirting, maybe buying things. That the idea of tucking the small structures underneath the large structures in a sort of ramshackle way, that this would have a very different atmosphere from the normal extended town. And of course, the series of projects that have been for towers over the years have made references to the collective intensity of the city. So dreams and reality of academia. After all, I've spent 50 years or thereabouts as a so-called academic. I've never regarded myself as an academic. I always thought I was a designer who did a bit of teaching on the side. I realized, having collected a few professorships, that's probably a bit naive. But the funny thing is, what one did in the early days, as a part of the plug-in city, one suggested a plug-in university. You will notice that even in Archigram times, one was concerned, unlike some of our contemporaries in other European countries who did kind of crazy schemes, that there are handrails, there are toilets, there are escalators at the correct pitch, there are doors that are the correct side. One had an element, and I was discussing this with somebody 2 days ago, there's an element of the sort of craft-based pedantic about some English work, including, I think, my own, which is that you say, yeah, it can be a wild scheme, but the bloody hell, the escalator ought to be at the right pitch. It doesn't work if it isn't, which, you can argue with. And in fact, then the notion of taking an academic situation, putting it on the road, which is really a post-rationalization of how we have found ourselves starting to give lectures in all sorts of places and carrying lots of slide projectors and apparatus. So, well, why can't this be formalized? Again, it was really the forerunner of the idea of the instant city, of putting an intense situation into packages and carting them around like a circus. On the other hand, much, much, much more recently, we were asked, with no result at all, to do a project for a university on a very tiny footprint. And so the idea was to take the footprint and pile the university like a kind of book stack with 4 primary sets of department, the engineering department, the arts, and so on. And each would have its own 4-story block with a space above the block so that it could extend with perhaps temporary structures into that space. But our largest job to date has been this, which is 2 buildings. On the left, the administration department, on the right, the law department of this Vienna Business University. And it was a competition win, a 3-stage competition win. And our principle really was to, A, get light into as much of the building as possible, B, to have interstitial spaces used. Now, I have traveled to many, and I see there's still people moving around the building, which is great. That I've been to so many universities where at 4:30 it's dead. And I was naive enough to hope that people might hang out in this university, despite the attractions of the first and second district of Vienna, which is just around, just up the street. I do notice that they still don't hang around as much as one would have designed for. But the notion is that not only do you cluster these buildings, you bring as much light into them as possible. And those dark blue spaces are places where you just might hang out. You don't have to go to a lecture. You don't have to do anything. Just hang out. And there's lots of terracing, again, for eating lunch or doing whatever you might want to be doing. And the building is coloured. A lot of Viennese architects, I think, don't like it being coloured, but we're a couple of seaside guys. And we say, I mean, if you know Vienna, and I know it really quite well, I have been so many times to Vienna. Beautiful city though it is, when it's grey and white and cold and the wind whistles down off the Alps. I mean, you can get bloody frozen in those grey streets. It's very depressing. And we said, hey, it doesn't have to be depressing. It can cheer it up. Let's bring some colour. Let's have sunshine corners. And we do bring, this is really sunshine. And we got an award from the people who live in the campus who said, yours is the most enjoyable building to be in. Great, yes. So why don't other people do it? And this is a very recent project which didn't win the competition for Graz, again for extension of a music school, where we thought a bit of cheer up was needed. And Graz, again, which I know very well, of course, is not quite as dour as Vienna. It's smaller and more curious and weirder and kookier. But we thought it ought to have not only interesting recital rooms, but also interesting pockets. I'm very interested at the moment in pockets of space, and I'll come back to that. Pockets of space, sort of residual spaces, not just the primary functioning space. What happens out there? What happens? Oops, great. What happens through there? What happens in between? Another academic building, of course, is the School of Architecture. By luck, one was in Brisbane when some guys were putting together a competition, and we were lucky enough to win it. And this is, of course, building a building for something which by that time one had spent 40 or more years being in. One is actually incumbent of architecture schools. And we were very lucky because they allowed us to also interfere with the brief. They said, look, we've only been running the school for 2 years. You guys know more about that stuff than we do. So yes, if you say you don't need that room, you do need this, why not? The building I will describe in detail later, but of course the key thing in southern Queensland is to deal with weather which can be hot and humid and can be very hot and dry at times, but also you get these sudden showers of rain. And a lot of it was to do with sun shielding, water shielding, and trying to make an atmosphere within the building. It was not just studios and classrooms, trying to give it a presence. I'll come back to that. More recently, in my original first college, before I went to the A, which is now Arts University, I was invited just to do a drawing studio, just a room for drawing in. And quite frankly, one went back to first principles. It is a blue room on the outside, a white room on the inside. It has two sources of light. One is a north light, and one is a clerestory that bounces additional light off the back wall. Just as the light level is decreasing into the room, you bounce some more light off the back, and the toilet's behind the wall. That's it. More recently, we've been working on, they came back to us for a second building, which is nice to report. We've been working on this building, we're now having to do a bit of cost cutting on it, which is a painful experience, but we're on the case. I've been working on it this morning, even on a squared tracing paper. And it involves talking about people, which I will come back to. A project really for startup companies. These are groups of postgraduates who are then chosen by the college to be supported for 1 year or 2 years possibly to start up their own companies. And the institution has already, though it's a small university, only about 3,000 students, but it already has a good track record in doing this. Another current project, which I can't say what it is for, I'm not allowed to, but I can't say really too much about it, except it is in northwest London somewhere. They've nearly rounded up all the money, and it is for art purposes. Thus, we can say, without telling you who and what, I can show you that there is, in fact, a public room at the street side. There are studios on the west and apartments for the idea is that you seduce certain working artists into coming there by giving them an apartment thrown in, which in London, at the London prices is really an incentive. And then there's a courtyard, which will be for, general courtyard pissing around, mainly, that is to say, performances and so on. And a glass floor, a non-slip glass floor, underneath which are all the workshops, so that we pack an enormous amount into a very tight site. And our hope is that it will be partly prefabricated, and you see the general look of it. So I come on to the realizable dream of the Kunsthaus in Graz. I think a pivotal point, just at the sort of point in one's life when one was about to become a kind of sort of footnote in history and done a couple of books and so on. Colin and I win this competition, and surprisingly, it happens. And the public in Graz, when it was published, voted 70% that they hated the building. They didn't want the building. After it was constructed, the same newspaper did the same survey, and 70% said they liked the building. And it appears on chocolate bars, T-shirts, toasters, posters for Austria, etc., etc. It has become a popular icon. I can give away the fact that strictly speaking, the nozzles don't bring enough light. They looked as if they would, but by the time you line them and everything, they're a little bit small. But they are, of course, its prickly presence. And the 920 pixels of light, which, of course, are computer-controlled and can be programmed to respond to somebody blowing their nose in the far corner of the town, or any, a beautiful art piece, or anything else you want to program, movements you can put on. I like the idea that it isn't, as you usually get these things, in a sort of rectangular box, that it's like body art. It rides the body of the building. But the actual pixel, just to get this giveaway onto the sort of realistics of the thing, the actual light rings are bathroom fittings. They're just regular bathroom fittings. It was cheap. As I said, it's not Foster high-tech, it's crap-tech. It's done cheapest way you can do. And it sits like a friendly old dog in the town. And the organizations we see in the plan, on the left were some houses we had to leave. At the bottom is a building we had to reconstruct called the Eisener's House. It's the oldest cast iron building in southern Austria. And then we squeeze what you could, it's almost like squeezing ketchup into an available piece of plate. And there it fills up the space. And then, because we both knew Graz very well, the organization, we knew the site. There used to be a dodgy bar there where I used to take students from the Bartlett when we visited, which we did quite often visit Graz. We kicked out, sadly, the dodgy bar, but we knew which corner you had to come in. We knew which was the busy street, the windy street, etc., etc. So a lot of the fundamental planning was sort of sitting in our heads. And that, I think, when we looked at the exhibition of 100 and however many projects had been done, we found that ours, though it's a little bit odd, if you like, it was much less complicated than many of the others. And that's that you do something that's sort of newish. But Actually, it's quite simple. The principles of organization are quite simple. And here, again, come back to this question of the interstitial spaces. Some of the best spaces, vis-a-vis that building, are the spaces between the external parts. And that's something you never get from the drawings, the models, the computer projection. You do it and you say, hey, that's a nice place to be. And that's sort of quite humbling in a way, that you however much you think you're smarty pants and you can predict, you can never quite predict. The dream of metamorphosis, going right back to Archigram times, the notion that a village could be a hovercraft that could stop, inflate, do something strange. The notion of a structure that metamorphoses from being almost a kind of stage one, almost a leftover plug-in city, and then gradually melts and melts and melts until it's, in the words of Cedric Price, a scrambled egg. But there is still architectural activity happening within. The notion of physical parts metamorphosing, stage by stage by stage. The notion of in this project, it's quite an elaborate project, something that starts in the left-hand slide as being a library and some offices and a sort of strange club atmosphere. This changes in the later stage because the cactus, which you see in the first drawing just as a shadow, the cactus architecture takes over. Now this sounds really loony. It was a very interesting process because the people who run the Ades gallery, Christian approached me once and said, we're going to do an exhibition in Berlin in a big Kunsthalle, and I'd like you to take part in it. And just want you to do, it's not a competition, there's no money, but I want you to do something to do with Berlin. And then the parting shot as she turned down, she said, and Danny Liebeskin's taking part in Metamorphosis and so on. Okay, I get the point. Better be good. And I sweated over this project for half a year, and there are many drawings, some of which have just gone to the Pompidou anyhow. And it includes a lot of funny ideas about referencing, about the idea of westernness, the Wild West generating strange cacti-like forms, the cacti then taking over the architecture, the spookiness of that part of Berlin, the notion that the Kurfürstendamm starts off heroically and then disappears into being almost nothing, etc., etc., etc. Memories of the sort of Christopher Isherwood period of Berlin, the mystery of Berlin. When I first went there, it's a divided city and was very spooky and full of strange pockets. It still has some of these. And then again, bringing a certain amount of kind of seasideness to it again. I think that's always lurking at the back of my... I use that as a prop anyhow. I use that as an excuse. Metamorphosis between suggested parts. Here, the first stage of the veg house, a series of armatures, minimum vegetation. Middle stages, the vegetation starts to take over. Some maneuvering of the armatures, and over 6 stages of the project, it ends up as being extremely weird, where I then say, hey, tell myself to stop the series of drawings because it's got so weird, I don't take it any further. Having started building then, there's also the metamorphosis of the object itself. I think that discussion that interests me greatly is the discussion of when is the magic moment of a project? And there's no pure answer to this, but it's an intriguing issue. Sometimes you can almost say the magic was the first scribble or the first little model. Or was it the carcass of the building? Was it the first stage of clothing the carcass? Or was it the finished stage? And it varies case to case, but when you work on these things, you know in deep down, probably never admit it to people, you know when the best moment of the building was. Not always the end state. You know all those buildings where it looks great with the the plastic sheathing over it. Then they strike the scaffolding and say, oh. But not always, not always. And there's also the notion of patina. We take the Vienna building again. There it is only 1 year separates those two pictures. I prefer the second picture, the later one, where the squeaky clean things, the timber started to go grey and refer back to the forest on the back of the building. The concrete has got some falling. The vegetation has started to move in, and our wish would be that the vegetation would move in even more. There can be the metamorphosis of an idea. It can go through a series of, as we see, sketches here leading to not, unfortunately, the final building, but the competition stage, which we won, but there was no money, of this project. Or it can be the metamorphosis idea that started off as a sort of visual statement and then luckily was worked through. This is Marcos Cruz once asked me to do a little piece for an AD, and I said, I'm going to talk about something. I love the idea of a comfortable vegetated club, Comfo Veg Club. The only thing you can't draw are the sort of acoustics and gadgetry, but there's the Comfo Veg Club. Then fast forward a while, and Eric Mouse asked me to do an exhibit at SciArc. And I said, right, I will do a version of the Comfo Veg Club, but we only had about $8,000, so it couldn't be quite as elaborate as the drawing. In fact, but it was the kind of Comfo Veg Club. And there we are. I had several ex-students of mine and friends, and there was a whole group of us, and we all pulled the socks over the rubber and put the plugs in. It was a handmade thing. Anyhow, that is the Comfo Veg Club. And indeed, it was very comfortable and very successful. In fact, it was so comfortable that late at night, very naughty things happened, which I regard as a success of the project. And then one was able to do something which has not happened before. I would like to see it happen again, which you'd constructed something, and then I went back to the more rarefied proposition, using the thing that had been constructed as part of so it's a sort of rollover. The idea, you do the simple version, you then roll that bit back into the idea. That's a form of metamorphosis. Or it can be the notion of the tower as an armature, as a kind of coat hanger upon which parts are placed. And these are various towers over very different periods where this principle has obtained. The dream of slithering, that's a funny one. And it's a kind of difficult to explain, but I once had to exhibit here next to this wonderful thing in Sao Paulo, which is Oscar Niemeyer's ramp at the end of the Biennale building. Very difficult. It's a killer if you're trying to exhibit against. You can't compete with that. Wonderful slithering ramp. But I had been there in my mind before, the notion of the swinging round the corner project is for Breitscheidplatz in Berlin. And in competitions, the idea of taking the bicycle and the movement of the bicycle as an enlivener for a campus. Again, a competition we did not win. And even slithering around the periphery of a building is just you take the Australian building, and again, it's not a four square thing. One almost moseys around the corner. And that goes right back into earlier work, the notion of the slithery, sleek, almost artificial corner. You can almost sense the syrup on one's tongue. And of course, a quotation of that back again to the Vienna building, sort of back and forth in a way, and even certain aspects of Graz and of the Australian building, where we don't just lock space, you can slither into it and slither out of it. Parallel dream of melting. Here, a very early project done with Christine Hawley is one where one goes from solidity through thick translucency, translucency to transparency. No actual window. I've been fascinated by what I call the tyranny of the window, which demands that you stop the wall and have a hole. I'm fascinated. There are some Japanese architects who've done middle territory where you go from the hole in the wall to muted glass, and then the glass which you look through. I'm fascinated by trying to attack what I call the tyranny of the window, particularly today where I've been drawing windows. And a lot of drawings to do with melting the window, trying to do this thing of solid through translucency. 2 bits of Graz where we almost pulled it off till the city started saying, hey, you guys are spending too much money. Don't piss around, finish the skin. But there's a couple of points in the building where we moved into that. Following the vegetated house was the vegetated village. Again, a series of 3 where one sees the thing gradually kind of suppurating. Or in another competition project where we went around the periphery of the Birmingham station by the color changing as you moved around. We managed to manipulate it so that the paler white buildings were on the sun side, the red buildings were facing a terracotta street, and the blue was facing in the direction of Jan Kaplitzky's Selfridges. Or melting too, this is a request from a very interesting Los Angeles magazine to do a piece of architecture that would somehow talk to Los Angeles and to London, both cities with which I'm very familiar and love, and I don't know, it really is London and Los Angeles, but it was trying to be. Another dream is the dream of flying, and I think that this permeates certainly 20th century projects. I mean, if you think of Zaha's work, you think of the building in Moscow by David Adjaye. You think of it, but you think in particular of the constructivists. You think of Chernikov. Now, there was a book in the AA library that when I was a 5th year student, we were just allowed to look at. We weren't allowed to touch it. We were allowed to, well, sort of touch it, but not because it's still there. It's very, very valuable. And the librarian stood there with a key. And one's tongue, this stuff was then subsequently published quite a lot, particularly by the Japanese, but at that time it just blew your mind. And I think it was somehow, I think Yale will remember that when I went on one of my visits to Graz and the steel work of the cantilevered part was sitting there, hadn't been clad, I burst into a smile because the 5th year student was still there in my head. I wanted this thing to sail into the sky. And indeed, having mentioned Yale, I will say that she, too, she's never expressed the fact that this project, which was constructed, of course, and yeah, you can see the wires, but it is again the notion, the architect's notion of the flying in the sky. Whether she admits to that or not, I don't know, but I like to appropriate in this notion of flying, this dream of the flight. And this drawing, which was a collage, I never did pills and drugs, but that one can see the skateboard, the dream, the feeling of flying. So there's the general dream of the tower. And I set myself a funny trick over the years, which is if I've been to somewhere for more than a month, and a few places I have been, I then take it upon myself to do a commentary upon the place in the form of a tower. It's not as if the place comes to me and says, do a tower. Nobody's come to me yet to do a tower. But I say, I'm getting the sniff of this place. I want to talk about it. So the first one, years ago in the 80s, was in Brisbane, the first time I was teaching for 5 weeks in Brisbane. And I looked And I did a pair of towers. The interesting one, I think, is the right-hand one, where I looked at those houses. I went around those houses where, in the early days of Brisbane, they would build these metal houses on legs to keep away from the bugs and so on, and allow, with the verandas, blow-through, ventilation. And I thought, why not have a tower that is effectively a series of these, one on top of the other? And that's really what the right-hand tower is. In my wife's town, which is Tel Aviv, I've also been interested in putting a series of towers in the middle of that circle. Niemeyer actually set up the idea of the project and suggested there should be 3 towers. Nobody's come and done them yet. So I said, well, let's suggest that the central of the 3 towers is a sort of entrepreneurial tower. And this is a reflection of my view of Tel Aviv, which is an extremely entrepreneurial city. And so what one has is effectively a kind of kebab stick with a series of different buildings attached to it. So rather like the university with the different departments, although this is more disparate because the constituent parts are very different one from the other. Some are to do with hotels, some are to do with sort of dentists, waiting rooms and things, some to do with car showrooms, etc. Very different sorts of activity. And each of those has its own building, but instead of the different buildings going like that, side to side, they're piled up. And you read them, unlike the sort of ubiquitous tower that you don't know what's inside it. This is saying, oh, it is a series of very definite constituent elements. And this is a bit of a flick of the wrist one, because it was fascination I've had ever since I was a second-year student with Brazil. Somehow or other, way back there in the 50s in Bournemouth, I got hold of material about Roberto Burle Marx, and there were films with Carmen Miranda in them, and then sort of Niemeyer was already well away, and eventually, of course, was able to visit a few times to Sao Paulo. And I wanted to do a piece of Brasiliana, so my tower on the left is me playing it Brazilian, if you like. I think it's not as thought through as the other towers, but anyway. And then another invitation from the same lady that put on the exhibition in Berlin. She had another one at the Arsenale in Paris, where she invited more or less the same cast of crooks to do projects for Paris. No money, but just do a project. And I was interested in taking a piece of English thinking, which is that you have your apartment, but you also have an escape hut in a garden behind, and trying to pile those escape huts up. Also, the apartments would rotate so that you could avoid the noisy neighbors, or you could look at the blooms in the Bois de Boulogne by pressing a button and rotating your house. A close friend of mine then came to me when it was published with a picture of some guy in Germany in 1928 who'd actually done a house that did exactly that. And, you know, it's funny with those, occasionally somebody says, you know, oh, it's all been done, and da-da-da. And if you have a certain psychology, you say, oh, you know, my life is hardly worth. Or you say, right, brilliant idea, isn't it? And you have to take the second view, I think. This is one for Los Angeles. Why cannot one bring the Hollywood Hills forward into Santa Monica? More recently, one that takes a corner near where we have our office in Highbury Corner, which has a lot of old sort of red brick and terracotta buildings at the base. And what it is suggesting is that the tower itself metamorphoses from the sort of terracotta through to a faceted architecture and up to a, in fact, digitally created manipulable architecture. So it's sort of 3 architectures, one merging into the other. So dreams can evolve into real stuff, and one is always intrigued by the place. One of the earliest proper buildings that I did was in Berlin. And Berlin remains one of my favorite town, probably my third favorite town, a place which I have a lot of associations with, not only doing funny drawings and funny lectures and funny exhibitions, but actually putting a little piece of foot down in Berlin. Project that won the competition only to find that somebody else built it and we didn't get any money, but that is Italy for you. And I'm fascinated in the project by taking extreme provinciality, the little town, this is only about a 20 or 30,000 person town, and that really the life in such a town happens, again, like with the Pinto scheme, it happens in the street. And you're asked to do a proper theatre with tip-up seats and fly tower and all the rest of it. Okay, you do the theatre, but you know in your heart of hearts that the real life will go on immediately around that theatre box. And this is what we concentrated upon. And we knitted it into the town with the same terracotta that is local to that town. Another Spanish experience has led to a building, but the Spanish economy has been so poor that what we have are the apartments and the car parking. The kiosks have never really taken off. The sports facilities on the roof have not happened. The blue isn't as blue as it should have been. And the wonderful shutters that we had haven't happened. But the essence of the building is there, and that raises a particular, again, an issue which many of you will face. I'm facing it right now with the Bournemouth project. If you take away some of the fancy parts, how much is left of the essence of the building? Is the essence of the building the planning? The planning is there, it works, the pipes don't leak, the elevators work, 100 happy families are there with their car parking. But those extra things, those particular shutters, the sports facility, the kiosk, would have actually made it sing. And you can argue, to what extent are they superficial? Or to what extent are they the essence of the building? Is the solid part all that the building is about? And I leave that as a sort of ponder. I mean, it's a discussable issue, again, rather like the issue of what is the magic moment of the building. I think buildings are much more complex than being organizations. Dream of overgrowth. One has been fascinated so far in having, a few clients now who never persuaded any of them to really let us put enough over. The Vienna one, you can see it's starting. But you bet when it starts to get really interesting, some fish face will come along with a hacker and hack it down. I'm just waiting for that to happen. But one has been fascinated years and years doing drawings of vegetation as a constituent element of the vocabulary of the building. Basically, veg as vocabulary, veg as a skimming condition. And starting to get involved in Germany, there were many times I gave lectures early on, and somebody would come up at the end and say, we have in the district, as you are drawing, you must go and see Schwetzingen, you must go and see this. And these two favorite examples, one is the Karlsruhe Castle Orangery, which actually boring people say, but surely it was going to have glass in it. The original drawing suggests that it did not have glass in it. It was intended to be a carcass upon which the growers would grow. And in Schwetzingen, of course, 18th century Italian gardeners did a whole lot of really wonderful mesh conditions. A drawing that I've pondered on a long time, probably can I admit, a favorite of my own work, is one where I set up a landscape, an imagined landscape, and some incursions of naughty bits of building. If you look though very carefully at the drawing, you can find other elements, little tiny pieces of obviously architectural parts. But furthermore, what is really of concern to me is the implication that even amongst rather random conditions, there are directions, there are drifts, there are configurations, there are combinations, which may or may not be tectonic. In other words, is there a can there be a conceptual or organic play between the consciously constructed and the naturally configuring? And I set the drawings, an elaborate drawing, up to force myself to have these thoughts. A number of other projects that Gavin and I have done, or the office has done, for vegetation projects. A city project, Super Houston, which looked at the particular part of Houston, which is really two-story. It's a large area of fairly bourgeois part of Houston, which is kilometers and kilometers of trees lying over streets. And then I placed in my Super Houston project a car control matrix that would enable you to drive amongst the trees and sit back almost asleep at the wheel, and then it would activate when you got next to your destination. Or is there even a kind of vegetational implication of constructed parts? Do we sometimes wrap together things almost like trees and bushes, but they are actually made of metallic elements? Now, here's a funny one. It's a bit of an aside. It's the dream of the hidey hole. I'm fascinated by architects of a certain period, particularly in this case, Ulbrich in Darmstadt and Schinkel in the Gleinecker Gardens in Berlin, where you find little intriguing pockets within the general scheme. Way back, an early project on the left was one where I suggested that a quite complex building would sit in a kind of hole in the ground. You would walk through the countryside and then almost imperceptibly come upon this mysterious town hidden in the ground. In Rauscham, a favourite garden near Oxford by William Kent, there are these very spooky, funny places where you almost expect dead bodies or frogs or they're very weird, where the water comes out of the ground into a pocket and then goes away. A favourite of mine is in my wife's town again, Tel Aviv. You have to understand that Tel Aviv is a very, very active town. This is a picture of the same street at 2 o'clock in the morning, heaving. It's a very busy, dusty street. You've got to get that context. And you walk along this dusty street, and suddenly there's this funny little pink thing with a funny little lady in it selling weird shit inside it. What? And it exists with this busy, dusty, commercial, who the fuck cares thing going on. And she resists me photographing her. We got inside a few months ago, and that's the stuff that she's selling. I'm fascinated by hidey holes. The escape, the wish to escape. Project we did for a competition for kiosks. A hedge house. I want this hedge to be a house. I'm not sure it is a house, and I don't want some boring fart to come along and say, actually, it's not a house, it's just an ordinary hedge, and the bloke cut holes in it. I want it to be a house because my brain says it should be a house, there should be a hedge house. Somehow this picture of Graz has got into the wrong place. Talking about getting up. Hey, anyhow, just in case you wondered how you got up to the upper floor and what people could do with it, there's a Solowit picture of the upper floor, and there's the travelator that whisks you secretly up to the upper floor. Shouldn't be in that location. Back to the hedge. Here's the hedge house reinterpreted. But even underneath the housing as built in Vallecas, there are secret places. In the Australian building, these scoops are secret places, or semi-secret places. In another Australian project, we put the scoops on the outside of the building. They would be hidey holes on the outside of the building. Or you can even have a building as an escape. So there's dreamed of stuff and real stuff. The dreamed of tower and its element. And the fact that one starts to produce, my God, is it a mannerism? 3 very different buildings, 3 orifices of different size, different material. The blue one is steel, the middle one is concrete, the left-hand one is covered in acrylic. But there is something, I have to start realizing that one has a preference for certain mannerisms, I think. I have to admit that. And only if you do a few buildings can you maybe arrive at that. On the other hand, much of one's drawing is to do with exploring the possibility of the range of the vocabulary. Sometimes it's to do with carving. We have been lucky enough to do the furniture for all of the Australian building and for some of the Vienna building. And we do produce these tables. We don't seem to be good at marketing them. We haven't really tried, but we do have what we call the crab table series, which involve carving and locking. Or there is the business of actually the process of making the thing as part of the reality. The steel building in Bournemouth, the blue one, was brought from Baltic actually, from the Baltic area of Germany, shipyard, and brought in pieces, dropped onto the concrete slab. I'm fascinated by gadgets. I think it may be a generational thing, it may be an English thing. If you think of the English achievements, if we can call them that, in the Second World War were largely to do with being inventive, making airplanes out of wood, making bouncing bombs, making strange inventions that used. And I think that followed through to the high tech. But, you know, they can be historic, they can be from the 19th century, they can be from the early 20th century, they can be from the mid-20th century, they can be from Archigram, David Green's Mobot, or they can be from things like the cartoons, which we see on the right, of William Heath Robinson, this extraordinary cartoonist who made silly inventions that would sort of do stupid things. But I think somebody is going to write a PhD thesis relating Heath Robinson to the British high-tech movement. It's a wonderful territory and could be done. But, you know, we are familiar every day with gadgets. This is a gadget. That's all it is. Some gadgets are fascinating. Some we don't quite understand. I mean, for my generation, it was, if you think of Archigram, everything that did something had a thing that looked like it ought to do something. And we even had, in the early days, the notion that the computers would exist on a heavy-duty floor. And now we all carry these things. I haven't got a clue what goes on inside that. You know, I just hope it works. And somebody tells me it does work, and it usually does work. But it has no presence. It could be for shaving. You know, if nobody told you. It could contain a dinner and a straw coming out of it. It could be something scratching a bum. I don't know what, but we happen to say this is a phone because I'm being told it's a phone. And that is, in a way, scary, because anything can be anything. A friend of mine in Germany, a former student, made this house where the bedroom pops in and out. And I was actually sitting on the bed, and it started raining, and we popped it in pretty damn fast. Robotics can be of any kind. They can be amusing robotics, they can be big, demonstrable, arty robotics, or they can be simple gadgetry, like almost our first built project, which is in Frankfurt, where I was a professor, a canteen where when it's hot, you open the roof. When it's cold, you shut the roof. Still a bit of a gadget. And I love going around finding people doing stupid gadgets. In the second version of the Taichung Tower, where we had got into the final, we had to be a bit more serious about the components that were involved in our idea of commercialized algae growing. It's what we made the tower about. We had to start putting apparatus on trays that were based upon the actual apparatus that exists. In the Australian building, the various scoops were produced by a complex shuttering process, German shuttering, that was programmed in such a way that you only had to have 3 or 4 positions of the shuttering reversed in order to produce original scoop. Each scoop is different, but uses a very minimum number of shuttering positions. This is partly a question of mathematics, of juxtaposing, partly the product of the thing at the bottom, which is this flexible shuttering system. The Aussies were shit scared of it. The first pour they did, they said, I'm not sure it's going to work. And then it worked. And then everybody smiled. I'm fascinated by the ugly and the silly. We did a project for Madrid, which was an ugly wall. Didn't get him. Jan and I were at the Shenzhen Biennale, and there was a stupid thing in the corner. I don't know who did it. It's probably meaningless, but I loved it. I sometimes do drawings which are really off the wall. They're really not, yes, this is not buildable. Well, not sure about that. Or you get silly, funny comments. When we built the Graz building, the Germans loved the blob. But then, this is the best bit. They had a conference in Frankfurt called Blobmeister. Blob, which is a silly English. And Meister, das ist der Meister, the Blobmeister. I love it. Culturally, it's a complete shit-up, but anyhow. And we do, after all, have a strong tradition of the blob. We have the most marvelous blob from the 19th century, and we did have Mr. Blobby, who's a TV person. I like sillies. Top 2 left-hand slides, and you can see them. I was taking a photo in Valparaiso, in Yelver's, you remember this, and there was a bloke in the kiosk who sort of saw, we had no language in common, of course. He saw that I was taking a photograph, and he brought his dog up from below, if you can just see the dog, so that I would photograph the dog running the kiosk. The trick then is to send it immediately to Tom Hennigan in Tokyo, who knows about these things. He immediately sent back a much better, because it's Japan, a much better dog in a much better kiosk. And then Yel was in Beijing and found a cat in a bag. And I like stuff like that. I mean, it's sort of nothing to do with architecture, but sort of it is. If and I like making a fool of myself, you know. This was in the period when one said the whole university could be carried on the head, you know. I mean, in fact, sticking that on that, I suppose. But you know, and I know, it's 4 pairs of sunglasses glued together and a piece of string. But it was the idea of doing the thing, rather than doing a drawing of it or a collage, of actually wearing it. There's another, we do, and as I said, I collect kiosks. All your good kiosks seem to have gone. The first time I came here, there were those old Soviet kiosks, I guess. They all seem to have disappeared. And I don't have any decent photos. Anyhow, stupid competitions. This is a competition for a footbridge in Skopje. I think the prize was about 500 euros. I mean, hardly worth even lifting the pen or computer or anything. Anyhow, we said, let's do it. God knows why we said, let's do it. And I said, let's put a kiosk on the bridge, you see. And Gavin said, why not make the kiosk move? And then I said, why not put a bar on top of the kiosk that moves so that you can have mum and dad can have a slivovitz or whatever they have in, and the kids can have the chalk ice underneath them. And there it is, moving. We even had Bureau Happel doing the bloody structure. Of course, we got nowhere in the competition. They built a horrible, I've seen it, not so nice. Anyway, but I still flog this project. It's an old project, and I still show it. Because somewhere, somebody, I'm hoping that somebody somewhere will say, What we need is a bridge with a kiosk. Maybe they'll buy the bar as well. I love colour. You can see that. Any excuse to use colour. There we are in Vienna with this tunnel that goes from the central courtyard through to the woods at the back, hoping that lots of people would hang around in it. And there are plenty of seats, but I'm not sure whether they do hang around it, but we would love them to hang around. And it's very red. Or it can be green. Or it can be multicolored. This is, strange enough, another project we can't say what it's for. It's for the moment jumped back into life. I don't think they've really got the money, but somehow the client has got somebody interested. I'd be very surprised if it gets built, but it would be wonderful if it did. And of course, one uses colour in exhibitions. And in the one I didn't show you, number 6 of the Veg House, it's even loonier than the number 6. So people and stuff. And I was talking the other day to the lady of the museum, she's probably here somewhere. Maybe. Hi. And in our conversation, we were talking about people and stuff, and I've added some more slides in of a very old project called Arcadia, where I had the notion that each type of, there were 6 types of people, each would have their own piece of city. So this is a real kind of snidey send-up of typical bourgeois English. The guy who makes a lot of fuss about collecting wine, the rather badly dressed wife, the rather naughty daughter, and a rather smug son who seems to have got knocked off the picture, and of course a dog and a chestnut tree. And so I tried to give them a suburbia that would fit their taste. Or there is a very straightforward family with the only piece of sort of minimalist architecture that I got near to. Well, a sensibly dressed kid, sensible car, sensible parents, correct number of children, and an orthogonal system. Or the hedonistic couple who spend all their time preparing themselves. They need 2 bathrooms, even in a small apartment, and artificial plants, and a translucent wall where you can just see the shadows of the neighbor, but you can't really see what they're doing. And a suburbia that or urbanism that supports it. Or this old couple, perhaps Viennese, with memories, rather beautiful furniture, real plants that they really bother to water, and a peninsula upon which they live in a degree of elegant isolation. Or dreamers and romantics living in the water in a series of dreaming towers. Or tough kind of New Yorkie characters. There's a story going on there, some kind of triangle story, and the window cleaner has seen it all. They live in a metallic building which is tough, with 3 locks to get you through the door. And I moved back to reality. This was the cartoon I did and submitted as part of the competition, the last stage of the competition, of what one wanted those interstitial spaces in Vienna to be like. Here are some Viennese types doing the things that I know Viennese types do. If you take a quick look at that. And the actuality of the spaces, I can't see any Viennese types doing anything. They're all sitting in class, which is rather sad. I'm a romantic, you see. Or here we are in Gold Coast, which is where our architecture school is. We were then in a competition, which we didn't win, for the cultural area of Gold Coast. It's a town of 500,000 people, 2 universities, international airport, and no bookshop. Think about it. And its clientele is the people you see at the bottom there. I must be careful not to be London-centric and snobby, but they are a particular kind of clientele. But here is back into that city where we did, after all, an architecture school. And I'm familiar with architecture schools. I will, in fact, be on a jury tomorrow, will I not, in this building? And here's a typical picture of a jury with a rather smarty-pants young faculty. It's always the young faculty who have to make themselves feel important on a jury. And he's saying, I can't do an Australian accent. He's saying, I question your terms of reference, Barbara. And there's Barbara, her hand shaking. And Wally, her friend, already very nervously pinning up. And Joe, who's got this electrical apparatus. This is a typical Bartlett story. An electrical or electronic apparatus which worked last Thursday, never works on the jury. And then you walk off somewhere, and then the tutor comes running after you down the corridor and says, it's working, it's working, it's working. But he's very fazed. He can tell there's going to be trouble. And indeed, it was based upon reality. It's actually a girl who I remember this jury at SciArc, and her hand is shaking. And then you do the building for it. And the building is very simple. It's an east-west building with a nose, which is where the head of the school has the office. The scoops, which are these spaces not for any particular purpose in the curriculum. They're for you to appropriate as you a couple of people having a tete-a-tete, a little tiny jury, somebody eating their lunch, somebody pinning something up, somebody putting their dog, whatever. The studio's on the south side, which is, after all, Australia. It's the cool side. The administration, toilets, blah, 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 postgraduate rooms on the north side, the hot side, and therefore one has small windows with overhangs. And life takes place. So we have this on the left, the central east-west street, and quite a lot of bridges. Here we are. Don't forget, Gold Coast has the best surfing beaches in Australia. Ha, nice to see you in the building, Jules. Jules obviously has mostly been at Surfers Paradise up the road. And there's the chief big and then there's another younger, maybe, tutor or teacher saying, oh, fuck, there's going to be a conversation here, heading off in the alternative direction. The key thing, and I know this from being the person where lots of boring people are coming in your direction, build in an alternative means of escape, both for Jules and for the beak. And we have extra means of escape. It's very important. Here was the justification of having the upper level of studios, as sort of open trays. Here's this poor creature, fancies the girl in black. I don't think he stands much chance, but he's going to work late just in case. And then, life imitating art. There, in fact, I found a girl in black sitting where I had put her in the cartoon. Or here, which is one, again, taking the street again, a group of people, academics, and flattering. Don't forget, these cartoons were done for the competition. It was a risky thing, but why not? And I'm flattering the institute, saying, that people will be floating in from Princeton. Oh, I won't be back to Princeton till Thursday. Yeah. And the types, I think, are very typical academia types. All the locals coming in, and I'm delighted to report that it is being used for weddings and other university-wide activities, which is what we always wanted. It shouldn't be just a stuffy old architecture school. And there's a very Australian man with teeth enjoying it, I think. And so there we are. And here's life imitating art. Again, the pomposity of architectural education is something I'm kind of hitting at. There is a bearded sort of intellectual saying, now look, chaps, we've got to go to the... And there's a poor old guy in the front who's mortgaged his house to do a master's degree, Poor, but I'm thinking, what's this all about? Was it a good idea? And then somebody photographs me in the building with my hand in exactly the same position as the guy in the cartoon, so screw you, Peacock. And we leave it for the guys to actually make the configuration. We give them these interlocking table system. There are 9 pieces of furniture, which 6 are tables of various kinds. And they can make 8-person groupings, 2-person, 5-person, blah, blah. And there's another thing, because all the time when we were designing the building, we were using the fact that I had been to and taught in lots of places, and Gavin had been to, I think, 3 schools of architecture. And we knew a lot of examples. And so instead of saying it has to be this and this, you remember that funny cupboard they've got at Cooper Union? You know that how the roof goes at the GSD? You know that funny thing down below the Bartlett? You know the room at the back of the A? You know, and we kept, you know, that UCLA had a particularly good corridor where you can watch the crit, but you don't go in the crit. Said, that's not a bad idea. And you kind of try and work some of they're based upon the anecdotes of operating in an architecture school rather than sort of correct things taken from Neufert or whatever the hell. But there are certain prejudices. I think it is essentially a Gothic kind of building. And as the sun sets in the west, and the most popular published photograph of the building, the cartoon where she's saying, I think it needs tweaking. All such projects, even when you win the competition, and it's built fairly quickly, they always need tweaking, and the tweaking is a very interesting part of the process. So back to Bournemouth. The Bournemouth studio was, after all, based upon the tradition of the artist studio, the north light, the bounce light, the consistency of colour, and back to that early drawing of when we thought it would have a blue floor. I'm glad we didn't give it a blue floor in the end. And I did a run back over the people in that drawing, the different types of people that you get in an art school, particularly in that location. Your East Europeans are often the most interesting students, we find currents. No, seriously. If you take the Bartlett, the A, Angevande and Sayre and Harvard, where I've all been involved in all of those institutions at the moment, the most interesting students, we call the East Europeans the new Germans. And they're winning the prizes. Interesting. Sit on some Bartlett juries. You hear it all the time. So then there's Tom, a local, there's a boat, a lot of boats are built in that town. He's been a carpenter, but now he's discovering art. The usual thing of the local girl who uses the art school as a sort of bit of a cheap finishing school. A guy who is trying to get visual, but he's too much of an intellectual, really. And, you know, a girl from Utah who finds it all, Europe's cool and amazing, you know. And a mum who's got rid of the kids finally, and she's finally doing what she would like to do. I have to admit that when you actually take a photograph in there, they are a little bit more consistent than in the cartoon. And the building is ideal for music recitals. The new building is elaborate. We're having to make it less elaborate. And finally, I get to a dream. Many of you people, I know this from received information, are very digital, not only digitally literate, but creatively digital, however we put this term. You spin stuff out of that stuff, and I know there's a lot going on in the Barton. I can't do it, I can only cartoon it, but I want you to get out of the fucking laboratory and get in there building the stuff. I don't care whether it's a garage roof or add on to an old pub or somebody's tire depot or something to keep pigs in. But it's all a bit too precious at the moment. It's all a bit too, you know, or it's only ZHA that can afford to do it. Or, okay, then the commercial guys as well. That's assuming they're not commercial. And I want it to get out there. I want to appropriate it. I can't do it, but it's stuff. It's no different from 100 and what years ago plate glass. Everybody got off on plate glass. And it has come into the mainstream. It has come, sometimes it's all glass. Now in New York it can't be all glass. Sometimes it's a lot of glass. But it affected architecture. But it wasn't the whole be-all and end-all of architecture. It was a constituent element that moved architecture forward. And I see there's an intellectual difference between the two, saying, this is the great breakthrough. But Yale, I think I'm borrowing from Yale in that conversation. She will say more. But it is obvious to see that sooner or later it has to join the mainstream. And you add it, you have bits of building that will be spun from the computer, like the old guys made thatch. And you will get bits of stuff spun from the computer, like those guys got off on steel fabrication. You know, it didn't mean that there wasn't the world before steel fabrication. But I think there's a sort of, in academic circles, there's a kind of intellectual worry about compromise, about mixing. And yet if you come in at the other end of the game, you're mixing stuff all the time. Graz was a mixture, you know, it's a mixture of concrete construction, steel construction, metal skin, and some plastic draped over it, and a few old local South European guys with a hacksaw, you know? And why not? The important thing was the building. Now, you may disagree with this, but I'm beaming it particularly at you because I have reported to me that you're very hot here in the digital. Oh, very hot in the digital, you know what I mean? Hot in the digital. Oh, yeah. Tally, bet the old digital hot. Yeah, could go with it, roll with it. And he was saying, well, I'm saying I'm surrounded by this stuff. I want to borrow it. I don't care whether you don't like the idea of that. And, you know, veg is very similar. I want to distort Bucky. I want to pull the growies on top of the skeleton and let some of them sprout. And here's a new version of a slide. The drawing was done a few months ago, a few weeks ago, whenever. And on the weekend, we were out in Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk, where there's this old monastery that's had some people pissing around, putting some buildings inside it. It suddenly struck me last night. I put one against the other because on the left-hand side, it's the same person doing it. On the right-hand side, God knows what was going on. But why not? Why not? Spookorama. And this is a beginning of another project, dangerous one, I suppose. I find that so many people I know who are hard-hearted, tough intellectually, modernists, postmodernists, post-post, whatever, all laboratory types, whatever, you know, hard Marxists and whatever the fuck. Then they go to an Italian hill town and they go, oh. So I say, right, if you can't beat them, join them. I'm going to do a P. Cook Italian hill town. It's going to have a campanile. It's going to have views of the nice old Tuscan roofs below it, people getting pissed on cheap wine, but it will have a few things of stuff in it. So I've had a few goes at this, another version. And here's the latest, which is I have drawn the plan of a town, a walled town with a campanile, with a few farmhouses around, with watercourses, facilities for car parking, some temporary structures, and I will proceed to draw the parts. I've just started the first one. But back to the buildings, back to reality, as if that wasn't. I have a predilection for noses. That's it, guys.
Vita. Time for questions and discussion. The audience.
Hi. As you mentioned, you are quite fascinated about the idea of a three-dimensional city, and also the buildings and projects you have are they have quite interesting three-dimensional, non-trivial forms and so on. But in the exploratory design process, you are using a lot of these very elaborate artwork quality, two-dimensional graphical design drawings. And it's a bit related to the last part of your talk when you kind of compare the digital and non-digital exploration. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the dimensionality in the exploratory phase. You did not show that much any three-dimensional physical models of the project.
No, we do actually, strange enough, in the studio. I suppose I ought to put those in. We do have a lot of quite rough, mostly cardboard models. We do have now a digital printing machine, but we tend to be using the cardboard model, and they're often very, very rough. And all the built projects have. In fact, I can report. Let's just take an easy one. The Blue Bournemouth studio. I got the letter. The guy asked. It wasn't a competition. The guy said, "Will you do this building?" And you say yes. And I was on the road, and I had my exercise book with squares on it. And within a day or something, I got the basic plan because it was obvious this is a sort of obvious thing to do. And I got back to Crab and I sat down and I made a big balsa wood model, that big. And I manipulated it. I made my cardboard man and moved him around and pulled, and I cut the model. I did what I've many times seen happening in Geary in his studio, cutting things, pinning things. And it's a real ruffle. We still have it on the wall, but I moved it, re-glued a piece, pushed it, pulled it, re-glued. And then somebody puts it on the computer, and then we get the sort of daylight right, and the engineer, which is AKT, came in. And the same thing happened as happened with Graz, which is the actual curvature of the top increases. You draw it like that, and the engineer said, no, it's more stable if it does that. So it swelled. The orifice got bigger. A few other things, but basically, if you look at it, it is the scheme. And it came straight from a jotting. In that case, there weren't elaborate drawings. In fact, I was so busy doing the drawings that existed, nearly all computer drawings. But the institution wanted me to have some sketches. And I'm not a sketcher. I do crappy sketches. I had to do some sketches. And I have them on the wall. But in fact, I do make models. It's funny that I don't use them in lectures. Maybe I would have to prove to you that all these things have models. I think that when I'm on crits, I'm very, very stiff on people telling me, it's a warning for anybody tomorrow, how far something is from something, how big it is, show me a person, take me to there, from there to there, because a lot of stuff that's produced that's beautiful three-dimensionally, often I find, these days, he says, the old guy, the student has no idea really of quite how big it is, you know? Because it could be, the person could be any height inside it. But even with a physical model, that can be, often one is concerned with the configuration. And that sometimes you're in love with configuration. And then the bloody balcony is of a certain height and has a balustrade. And interferes with that configuration. Which is why I think instinctively one thinks skeletally, probably. You know, I still am a positionist. And I find that I claim that I can read into a plan the implications of the height. I find, on the other hand, this was something of my generation of people at the AA, which we were judged on the quality of the section. You could get a prize if a building had a good section. Sometimes didn't even have an elevation at all. But if the section, I love sections because they are both picture and organization. You know, a plan, in a way, is only an organization. An elevation is only a picture, but a section is both pictorial and should be organizational. But it's interesting you raise that point, because I haven't often had that point raised. But I think I also enjoy drawing. I'm not a naturally good drawer. There were many people, even in the little school in Bournemouth, in my class who were much better drawers. They could draw horses and trees. And I'm a turgid drawer, but I forced myself not to let the side down. I've also been very lucky that I've worked alongside some very good drawers. And you don't want to let the side down. So you force yourself to learn vaguely how to draw vegetation, not really proper trees, but stuff that looks like veg. You force yourself to draw the impossible, which you can't. You know, you try anything that will do it. You know, airbrushes and I don't know, whatever. And I just enjoy colour. I find that, you know, black and grey and white on a day like this is a bit depressing. And if, you know, particularly in the bloody Baltic, you know, which is, I mean, I go often to Lund and Malmo, and that gets a certain sort of weather. You know, it blows round the corner of that part of Europe. Oh, I think I've been there, you know, I don't know, 40 times, of which 2 days have been okay. And yet people build, well, they don't quite so much. And certainly Denmark, you know, Denmark's twig that you can have a bit of colour. It's funny. I think it's a morality thing. I mean, I have a wicked slide, which I didn't put here because it wasn't appropriate. But I have a wicked slide of 8 male architects, a couple of them dead, the rest ought to be. And they all have serious faces. And my caption is, "Architecture is no laughing matter." And I have a feeling that this kind of almost Calvinist thing goes with, we all wear black, you know, and we all look serious, and we all ask serious questions at juries. We all do grey buildings, or white if you twist my arm, black because it's sexier, you know, etc. And I think, bloody hell, you know, God, you're a long time dead. You know, and I just, instead, maybe that I cling to the seaside. It's my excuse. I didn't live I was an army brat. I lived all over the place. But the places that have resonated have tended to be the seaside, where, and I claim that the plug-in city was the product of the seaside, that in the summer, in March, April, people start to bring out the tarpaulin. They start to fix the wooden parts. They start to bring out the fairy lights. They start to open up. They start being jolly. And then September, October, it folds. And that is a plug-in city. That is a responsive environment, actually. Sorry, I moved right off the question.
Thanks a
I
lot.
haven't really answered the question adequately, but I'll have to put some more pictures in, and then you'll know.
Thanks.
For more than 50 years, you have been practicing and drawing and designing and constructing, and just now you showed some works of the contemporaries, like those post-digital, as they call it, this Bartlett drawings that you think that has some kind of a influence or is corresponded in your drawings. But I mean, in between there has been a lot of different other areas of architecture, of this continuity and parametricism, etc. So why do you think that now this post-digital, this quite rather contemporary thing, has become part or is somehow sneaking into your drawing?
Oh yeah, I'll admit that.
And why not before?
I wasn't attracted to it.
So
I mean, there's some things that you just say, you know they're fashionable and you just don't like them, like minimalism. I can't get my head around minimalism. I can't see what's in it. It bores me to teeth. And I'm sorry, it might be fashionable, it might be the good thing to do, but fuck that, you know. I don't like Greek flute music, you know. Why should I? There's no necessity for me to. I don't like minimal architecture. I find it intensely boring. You know, it's too pious. It's too Calvinist. It's too.
So is it the complexity?
What?
Is it the complexity that triggers then the dialogue?
It's stimulus. I think that architecture, in the end, in fact, all situations, but certainly if you're consciously constructing them, are a form of theatre. I go to the toilet here. I go down some stairs, and there is a door that is for a bomb shelter. And, you know, I'm a child that was a child in the wartime. I can't just then go and have an ordinary pee. Now, say it wasn't. Say it was you just go down the stairs, there's a normal door handle, go into the loo, pee. I've forgotten it in a nanosecond. I've already taken this is going to be circulated to my 6 closest friends within a matter of a couple of hours. I say, I've already sent some stuff to some people about your town. And I think it will. There's a wonderful thing in our hotel, which is a sign that dogs must not shit. I've never seen that anywhere else in the world. So it's the first thing I send out to my 3 or 4 closest friends. It's this thing. I say, be careful be careful in Tallinn. The door and the dog. Hey, that's life. If it's just an ordinary sign for sort of, you know, parking or an ordinary door to a toilet, life is a bit dull. I think a lot of architecture is very dull. But you get some loony who does this building with funny windows. I don't think it's a great building, but yeah, there's a bit going for it. At least he had the balls to do some weird windows, you know. I mean, I know that my position is, I have presumed for most of my working life that 2/3 of the people don't like what I do. 2/3 architects don't like what I do. It either irritates them, or they think it's irrelevant, or they think, whatever they think. But I don't do it as a dare to them, I'm not interested in that. The third, who probably do find something interesting in it, I'm very intrigued to remind that the basic principles of the projects are fairly straightforward, common sense principles. I mean, I think something that should be taught in every architecture school, this is going off your question, is common sense. I think there ought to be a class in applied common sense. I think there ought to be another class in applied observation. And I always quote one of my favorite students way back at the AA, who did a bus station. And she showed me this bus station. So I said, do you ever go on the bus? She said, yeah, sure, I go every morning on the bus. I said, think how you got off the bus. She had drawn an American way round bus station because she had gone to Neufeld or whatever the hell, and hadn't remembered that she was on the bus. She didn't think through the theatre, as I would call it, of getting off the bus onto a platform, walking down the street, which is what the thing is about. And I think that it's very, and I don't, in a way, the availability of material on the computer hasn't helped that people look and grab down stuff, but they don't put themselves into it. It's difficult because I think one is privileged over here. You know, I'm particularly privileged in that I've been able to travel and visit a lot of very good buildings, often with the architect concerned. And then you see the things that even the best magazine or best documentation can't tell you, which is to do with space, light, positioning, interstitial spaces, funny things that happen, the relation between what appears to be the organization and the actual experience of the building. You know, and one learns funny things through, like back to the three-dimensionality thing. Christine Hawley and I, when we did the building in Berlin, the little housing project, we agonized over the entrance hall because there's a column that had to come down and it appeared to be a very tight space. I'm really worried that this entrance hall was really tight. When we built, it seemed great because we had not thought in terms of the fact you look down into the stair down to the basement and you look up the stair to the first floor, and actually it was a much larger space and the column didn't matter. And you had to build to get that. I find that, you know, the first time one realized that radiator positions and the depth, the degree of shadow underneath a beam, how dark the shadow is, matters as much as the diagram. The bloody diagram, you can get it, you know. And I found one of the funny things was that not having built and then starting to build quite late, I found I got scale quite accurately. Somehow or other, the stuff I built has always genuinely felt about the size that I thought it would. But these things about shadow and position and dimension, you have to do quite a lot of building to start getting your nose around it. Now, I don't know whether that wasn't answering your question at all. Go on to something more interesting. Any more?
So, sorry if I'm turning the conversation into some esoteric woo, but your experimentation with vegetation and the towers kind of made me think about perhaps the greatest city none of us has ever seen, you know, Babylon. And I think what makes Babylon so fascinating as a town is that it's impossible, the way we think about it. You know, walking through the gates of Ishtar and seeing the magical place and pagan, naughty place as well. So, could you care to comment about the possibility of city as itself, as an idea, not as a thing where dogs aren't allowed to poop?
I'm not quite sure what, I mean, I hear you. I'm not sure what the nature of the answer should be. I don't think, you see, what I'm trying to get across is that a lot of the projects that are apparently dreams are realizable. And I think it has been I come back to that statement I made earlier, which is that a lot of, not only mainstream, you know, the man in the street, the mainstream architect, etc., but perhaps also academics are quite attracted to not having to deal with reality. I think there are a lot of people in architecture, a lot of people teaching architecture, dare I say, who get very, and I know people teaching the art who are brilliant, like really superb teachers and have been superb designers. They even get their kitchen done by another architect. I find that tragic, this avoidance of combat. I find it irritating, actually, if I'm really honest. You know, I always wanted to build. I don't want to build lots, and I think there's certain sacrifices that sometimes have to be made. But it's bloody interesting. Difficult, but interesting. And a lot of the funny ideas that you have can exist in reality, and to be too much attracted by non-reality as a sort of higher thing, I think is very questionable. I've never regarded my stuff as utopian. I'm not interested in utopia. Utopia is like some mumbo-jumbo religion, as far as I'm concerned. I'm interested in stuff. I have other lectures called Stuff, actually. And I'm really interested in stuff. Nobody has come to me for a tower, and I suffer from heights anyhow. Although I know other designers of towers have suffered from heights. There is something about the tower in relation to the statement of city. But I can think of odd examples of towers, particularly in the English countryside, of strange towers that sort of rich people have put up in a sort of almost abstracted location. But I know, Babylon, you know, it's quite funny. I'll take a sort of sideways example. I went 4 years ago, whenever it was, to Phoenix, and I was taken to Arcosanti. And I remember, whatever his name who did it, slipped my mind now. It was this famous drawn city, and then he managed to get these sort of followers and students, whatever they were, to build bits of it. And it's a funny, crappy old thing. I mean, basically, but the funniest thing I found was a refrigerator. There's somehow an ordinary refrigerator had been built into the concrete work, stuck out. I found that the best part, but I found it sort of creepy and very kind of spookily alternative-y, like, oh, the drawings were lovely, but the actual stuff, he was an Italian potter, basically. But I didn't find the stuff engaging at all. But it was sort of weird and a bit, you know. So sometimes, you know, I'm much more interested in back streets of Tokyo, where you get everybody sort of contributing in a sense. You know, you start getting interested in the position of air conditioners vis-a-vis the odd machine that sells drinks, vis-a-vis somebody who's painted the wall red, vis-a-vis some bamboo hanging down, vis-a-vis some modernist detailing. You know, your brain is working overtime. I love forcing my brain to consider things, but abstract. I'm not into the abstract. I really am not. I find it. Here we go. You know, it's all shoved into, like I said at the beginning, shoved into a pocket of non-combative thing. The whole point, and I have to name drop, the person I was having the conversation with was Rem Koolhaas, and we used to live near each other. And we suddenly talked in the street 10 or more years ago, whenever it was, about all these people we'd remembered that all of whom had built. We said, well, what do those buggers say now? But I would also equally say, what about the academics who want it all to be sort of categorized and perfect and kept in pockets? And, if you start building it and it's not quite the same, you know, it's like somebody who buys cookery books but sort of cooks incredibly badly, or never cooks at all, but they love the idea of watching a master chef on TV. Do I answer your question? Not as you would wish, perhaps.
You do, not as I would expect.
Right.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, good. Thank you.